I'm taking a little bit of an evening walk because the weather's so pleasant. So if my connection uh, has any issues, let me know and I'll scramble back to the Wi-Fi.
Honestly, I can't even blame you. You certainly won't be the first one to have a bad service here in one of these spaces.
Is it all right so far, though?
Oh, yeah, you're good.
Very good.
Can you hear my fire crackling?
Yeah, I thought I heard something.
I thought I might have the blinker on my car.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Sorry, I've always got background noise of some sort going on. If it gets too bad,
hit
I'll mute it.
521 followers on the account. That's
Hey,
pretty
nice.
cool.
Nice.
I've said this before. Oh, no, go ahead.
Oh, you go ahead, Luke.
Oh, no, I was saying, I've said this before, but Nathanael Greene's countenance, for some reason, makes every tweet funnier. I don't know what it is, but, just really adds to the account. I think whoever picked that photo did a good job.
Oh, yeah? See, I'm debating putting the blue eyes Nathanael Greene smoking an absolute heater. I don't know if that would take away from the character or not.
It might take away from the character of the account. It might not make it a little bit less official, but Nathanael Greene, Dark MAGA, does go hard.
I mean, Nathanael Greene, I guess, was a dark MAGA, for his time. You know?
I think he was, you could classify him as MAG.
Yeah, there
Make
you go.
America great.
Or just make America.
Yeah, just make America.
But nobody wants to call him Ma, because, I don't know. Yeah, so MAG is probably better.
I have this one log in my fire pit that I've had probably 4 or 5 fires, and it just refuses to burn down. And I don't think tonight's going to be any different.
What a night to have a fire.
Yeah, dude, it's beautiful out here. It's really a great night. Could be a little cooler, but it's going to cool off in a couple hours. I can't complain too much.
I haven't joined as many of these spaces as I how many listeners do we how many participants do we get up to typically before we begin? Do we wait probably 10 minutes or so?
Honestly, based off past patterns, I think we might just be good to go ahead and start. We're also recorded, so anyone who listens later will have the benefit of not listening to 10 or 15 minutes of filler.
That sounds great. Well, one of the things that has been, do you start with a kind of an introduction? How do we start this off?
Well, introductions aren't bad for any future listeners. Or let's see. Yeah, so my name's Luke. I am the president of the Nathanael Greene Society. I'll be one of your hosts tonight, and our other officers will introduce themselves as well.
Yeah, I'm Horatius, the most banned man alive. I run the society account, but don't tell X that because they'll ban it again. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm Kevbot, NGS secretary. Nice to meet you again.
Hey, Brandon, this is Ken Ham, Drown Rappers Under the Arc-Roiper. I met you at the American Reformer Reading Group. Good to see you again. I'm the vice president of the Nathanael Greene Society.
Good to see you again. And thanks for the invite to this group. I'm Brandon, a newer member of the Nathanael Greene Society as of, I think, the beginning of last month. It's a good group to be a part of. So one of the things that, I think would be an interesting point of discussion this evening is, what does it mean to be a North Carolinian? Because if you think about how people construct their identities today, your state, not even your region really, but much less your state, doesn't make a huge impact on how you identify as an American. I think probably you do still have broad regional differences. The South still has some identity that hasn't been fully reconstructed. But if you look at how Americans identified themselves 150 years ago, there's very much I'm a North Carolinian mentality, or I'm a Pennsylvanian, uh, or I'm from Vermont, or I'm from Florida. You had much stronger regional identities, which I think is a crucial concept to our Republican form of government, the whole federalist idea, self-governance in general. And I think we need to recover some of that. So that's one of the things that I like about the way the Old Glory Club and the Nathanael Greene Society is structured. It's not a national organization per se, but very much puts an emphasis on recovering some of these more local identities.
No, I think you're definitely right. There's some states that still have a little bit of an identity, but a lot of times it's kind of truncated. So, people from Texas are proud to be from Texas, but a lot of times it's relatively superficial. It might be an affinity for cowboy hats or something, and you don't get much. Yeah. Well, he's the world's proudest Ohioan, so. Yeah. No, but to your point, yes. There's not as much state pride as we would like to see. In fact, very little. And North Carolina in particular kind of struggles, I feel like, a little bit. I sometimes feel like we have a sort of Canadian identity in the sense, how Canada kind of defines itself as not America. Sometimes we have a tendency to define ourselves as not being South Carolina or Virginia. But
amen.
Yeah.
Do you think some of that has to do with? I've viewed North Carolina as in like. So back when I was younger, and definitely maybe to about 20 years ago, I heard a lot of. Most of the people that I knew were from around the area, but now, when I meet new people out and about, most of the people are not from here, and it's almost like we've become a transit state in some regard. Do you think that attitude has something to do with that?
Yeah. So that I actually hadn't thought about it in those terms. I do think North Carolina tends to define itself as being like maybe a threshold of transition between several different types of places. So, North Carolinians are really proud of having the mountains, the Piedmont, and the beach, right? So, they love that transitional geography, but we're also simultaneously the intersection of I-40. So we get a lot of people who move through the state as kind of a juncture. That makes sense.
We also have a fair population of what we jokingly called growing up halfbacks, where snowbirds move down to Florida, realize it's too hot, and then they settle somewhere between Rock Hill and kind of the Charlotte area. And I think you have I kind of break it up into three waves. You have the 1990s New Yorkers that moved to the Carolinas. Then you have 2000 housing market crash New Yorkers, New Jerseyans, And then you have the people that are moving here now, which are kind of like they're like third wave New Yorkers, but they have a different vibe about them. Like some of them are pretty far right, but then a fair amount of them are still like they the older boomers hold on to this like New York mentality of dogging the South about our cuisine. So there's like these like subcategories of I guess you could say like northern refugees, if you want to call them that.
He's talking about you, Kenham.
That's literally me.
I'm guilty too. I moved to North Carolina in 2018. So, there's a concept that I've been talking about with friends. There is a term in the machinist's shop, which is known as concentricity. So basically, the axis of two parts that are working together, the axis of rotation needs to be aligned. Otherwise, this part won't work. The part's effectively broken. So, a friend of mine plays around with the term of reconcentricity when it comes to learning how to recenter our society at a more micro level on shared identities in our very transitory era. How do we get all of these, if you've ever taken a magnet and put it in the middle of all of these iron shavings and watch the iron shavings line up. How do we do that in our society today? Because, like you said, we have a society in North Carolina that's very mixed of people who arrived here at various points in time. And I think one of the reasons why a state identity comes difficult is because North Carolina never had major cities. We were an agrarian society. Raleigh was backwater even in the 1950s and 1960s. So it's really only, especially the internet era, that's allowed things to boom. Because we didn't have major port cities, not like Boston or Philadelphia or Baltimore. And so our population was always fairly small. So now we need to look at how do we take the people that are here and to a degree assimilate them into a shared North Carolina identity. This principle of reconcentricity, I think, bringing people into alignment, despite not necessarily having a common background in this state going back for ages. How do we do that?
There's a little, it's kind of cringy, but there seems to be if you were a 1990s New Yorker that moved down here, um, you had kids and they grew up in this area and they probably went to one of your public universities like the UNC system, whether it's Charlotte or Chapel Hill, or they ended up going to State or App. And there seems to be the strongest correlation would be around sports, which is kind of stupid that that's what it is. But they'll, even though they're from New York, they'll fly a Carolina flag or a Duke flag or a App flag on their house. So that seems to be something that maybe in a generation or two, just around sports alone. But that's
Yeah.
the only kind of thing I've seen that people collectively kind of rally around is Carolina sports teams.
You're not wrong, because so we were briefly chatting about this in our group chat about how the ACC tournament, around March Madness, the ACC tournament was the big thing around here, and then it moved to New York City, but it was hosted in Greensboro, and I remember being a kid, and we would just sit around the early March, and there was basically that Thursday and Friday there were no classes from about 11 on, because just about every single room had a TV in there, and we were all watching the ACC tournament. Um, Now I know that doesn't go on, and so that was like a somewhat like you were saying, like, yeah, it's kind of cringy. but it was a shared cultural experience that we all had. And everyone talked about their favorite ACC team, and obviously it was biased towards, State or Wake Forest or UNC or Duke. And, everybody made fun of Clemson, or Virginia, but still, like, it was still somewhat of a cultural, a significant cultural event that took place, and everybody knew who was on the team, and had their favorite teams, and everybody, even if they didn't care about sports, they were at least invested for a week or two, and then you would see some people actually, getting into more local sports, and then it kind of carried on into some other things. So that's not necessarily the worst idea ever.
No, and another thing to consider there is, North Carolina universities, especially the big ones, are pretty well recognized nationwide, and they attract a lot of students from other states. So, like, it kind of makes sense that those would be the integration points, if you want to think of it that way, for people out of state. Because for a lot of people, they actually do have organic connections to the schools. Like, beyond just fandom, a lot of them probably attended those schools. There's that quote by, I forget the guy's name. I think he used to be a judge in North Carolina. But he had some line about how, he's lived in North Carolina his whole life except for his 4 years of attending Duke. And like there's a lot of truth there. I mean, like, if you go to Duke, all those kids are from New Jersey.
Yeah.
Or like China.
Yeah. But you see this also in the there's like the opposite effect that happens with the, I guess you could say, the professional league sports, like Carolina Panther fans, and I don't really keep up with sports, but this is just like personal observations. Like, people will hold true to being a Baltimore Raven fan or a New York Giants fan, but they won't root for Carolina at the kind of the professional league level because they're not from here. So they still maintain this like low level cultural identity with sports of where they come from. But you'll see that their kids, however, will pull for Carolina in the games and stuff like that, and they'll have like a loose affiliation with maybe their parents' team. So there is, like, I guess, some kind of mimetic level of cultural just through bread and circus. But North Carolina doesn't, I don't think, anymore has a like distinct identity if you live in a metropolitan area or even like around a greater area of a metropolitan area. So people end up just kind of flocking, to either the college teams because that's where their kid goes and they want to pull for that school, or they just kind of resort back to the default, I'm a Buffalo fan or something like that. So, because there's not generational sports teams here anyway. So there's not like that kind of like deep legacy that people have a love for. And I mean, that's just like a really surface level. I can't really think of, besides sports, anything else in North Carolina that pulls people towards a North Carolina identity besides like bread and circus.
Brandon, what do you think? You're the one who started us here. Do you have any thesis on what kind of holds the state together, maybe besides colleges?
Well, I think that's something that we can find an opportunity zone in. We can work to create that identity to a certain degree. Think about how central a phrase like "don't mess with Texas" is to Texans. Um, it's very much a part of the Texan identity now. You see it on signs, you see it on bumper stickers. Everybody's heard the phrase, but it was a phrase made up in the 1990s, as I understand it. Maybe it was before, but it was to deal with people littering. You don't throw on trash on the sides of Texas highways because you don't mess with Texas. Now it's become a part of like their cultural existence. Um, it's a phrase that's a part of what it means to be a Texan. So one of the things that I did last Independence Day was spend the day researching, reading about some of our signers of the Declaration of Independence here in North Carolina. And I've always been a little bit of a history nerd, maybe not to the extent that some of y'all are, perhaps because I had never heard of any of them. I had never actually studied their lives in a substantial way. And I think that's a weak point. I think we can actually work to construct something of a more regional identity that came just in the course of human events in the past, but needs to be developed intentionally now. And it's perhaps more important than ever as you almost see this pushing out of old Carolina with all of the business interests and 1B visas and foreign students and such coming in. It's almost more important to start to build that regional identity among heritage Americans, which is one of the reasons that I think the Nathanael Greene Society exists. So, what are some points at which we can center that? And I think historical figures like Nathanael Greene make that a more familiar name to people would be helpful. I think agriculture, finding ways to celebrate regional agriculture could be helpful. One of the things that I need to study out more is the old tobacco days that a lot of municipalities would have. Back in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, you can see these pictures where it's almost like this July 4th type old Americana festival where you have somebody has some background noise. Where you have like this old Americana type celebration of people showing it's almost like a rodeo centered around tobacco. So I think that's where can we find these identities that North Carolina's had in the past and start to build some cultural awareness and celebration, Americana type activity around it.
If you're going to go with agriculture, and I think that is a good place to start, tobacco is huge. R.J. Reynolds tobacco was a huge part of the state. You know, like other tobacco companies were a big part of the state. Another, if you're going agriculture, another thing if you're going kind of further east of the state is pork. So like the whole Smithfield production is important. Honestly, it's still important, but it has historic pedigree as well.
Yeah. And when you talk
they're owned by
agriculture,
China now, are they not, Smithfield?
yes, they are owned by China as of 2014. The other big aspect of agriculture in North Carolina is relatively recent, but we are the biggest Christmas tree producer in the nation, and that's huge. That's basically the entire Appalachian part of the state, especially up in the northwestern part of the state. With the Fraser fir industry in particular, it's a massive agricultural industry up in the mountains.
Yeah, on
Yeah, I'm
the
not really sure.
go ahead. No, you can go ahead.
Yeah, I think that the thing with the tobacco industry, and I'm a little familiar with it. Just well, I had a lot of family from Kentucky, is where most of them are from, and tobacco was big up there. But I think the tobacco industry has largely basically been killed now. You don't have the same kind of. There's still, I think, one celebration towards I think the apex area, but it doesn't exist at a whole scale level where you almost have like town founders days centered around that, where you have like your 3 grades of tobacco and they're hanging them and drying them and curing them and everything. And it was kind of like a big come together moment, because that's really when like profits would roll in for people in the industry. And you don't have that anymore. That left. We had a lot of your small towns were also textile towns. And you had, which also, when you have that kind of manufacturing, you have an immigrant population. So this isn't something like new to us in the Carolinas. But you had the textile industry that existed. I know in my area, right outside Cannon Village, used to be owned by the Cannon family, and you had Pillatex out there, and pretty much the factories left in the early 2000s. Philip Morse, they left in the early 2000s. We've been hit really hard with either an industry dying because of popularity or an industry dying because the means that people worked in those towns and industries, they just got offshored
Yeah,
over the years.
between the tobacco, because most of my family worked for RJR. My dad and a couple of my uncles retired from Reynolds, and we've talked about this before. It got hit hard, and RJR around here, they did a lot for the Winston-Salem area and the surrounding towns and cities. And it was a lot of patronage. And really, once the company started getting hit by lawsuit after lawsuit, and the decline in smoking, that really just kind of destroyed what was left for that industry. And on the furniture, around here too, we have High Point, and the big to do for the longest time was the furniture market, and I don't even hear about that anymore. I know that they still have it, but that was huge. Like High Point pretty much was shut down for the furniture market years and years ago, and I think some of that changed because they started shipping some of those jobs overseas. I have a friend that's worked in the furniture market for years, and he mostly just now travels to like Thailand and Vietnam, because I think a lot of that has been sourced over there now. So a lot of those industries have either been hit hard by lawfare, government regulations, or just outsourcing.
And the thing with the furniture market, I've completely forgot about that. I mean, it's just one of many industries that North Carolina was heavily involved in manufacturing. But with the furniture market, I believe that we don't tariff any furniture that comes from China or other countries. So what you end up having is you end up having where people are just buying furniture on Amazon for $100 rather than a cheap table that lasts 3 or 4 years and they dispose of it and throw it away. Rather than if you bought a table for your family, it kind of was expected that you would probably keep that until you passed it down to your kids when they were moving out of the house, and give them some starter furniture, and you would buy some new yourself. So something like that doesn't exist anymore, where people are buying quality made American products anymore. Now it's just a kind of disposable economy. And I think Trump even brought that up in one of his rallies or speeches or something like that, I remember, where he brought up North Carolina being kind of a capital for furniture making that basically just gets exploited by China and the rest of them. And there's no, like, the furniture that we send out, no tariff. The furniture that comes into to us, there is no tariff. But that's the thing where it's like if you could level the playing field again and be able to have some kind of vibrant manufacturing economy in the Carolinas, that would be, massive. There's also hatcheries that exist all over the state too, but even that is, taking a hit with, where you can basically import fish and everything else like that now. So, that's something that's like every single industry, like you said, either got hit by lawfare or basically after NAFTA, we got crushed. And, you have a wide open border, then in comes drugs, people don't have jobs anymore. And, pretty much that's what we're seeing now is a lot of these towns that were once staples of the state have all just turned to absolute, debauchery of homelessness and drugs and crime, because people have no gainful employment. They had no. I mean, I don't want to like take a dump on them, but people didn't have any other skills besides those professions that their parents worked and their parents before them worked. And there was no when they came of age, there was no job. So a lot of people that were able to move out of the state and find some sort of tech job or uh, financial job, that's what they did. They kind of congregated into the cities, and you end up having your your Nick Land theory with the IQ shredder theory, where these people that were actually cream of the crop for their town, they didn't stick around and they left, and the people that were so unfortunate not to be able to move ended up staying there and falling into the vices of the time.
And that actually is probably another reason why colleges have become so important for state identity, is because the universities helped, and this isn't all bad, but the universities helped facilitate North Carolina's economy from more of what economists would call a secondary economy, which had a lot of manufacturing and agriculture too. But I mean, some of that's still there, but it helped transition the state's economy towards new ventures. So probably the newest big venture in North Carolina is biomedical, which has been around for a while, but biomedical has exploded. That is that's a huge part of the state economy now, but one that we really ought not to neglect, and this is really big, especially around Charlotte, is just the really kind of surprising and continued growth of the state's banking sector. So if I remember correctly, Bank of America was already headquartered in Charlotte, but you have to remember that BB&T has always been headquartered in Charlotte. Or, no, sorry, not in Charlotte, but in the state. They used to be headquartered in North Carolina, and they merged with SunTrust and reconstituted in Charlotte. So, I mean, Truist is like the nation's, I think, fifth or sixth largest bank, and Bank of America is like number 2. So we have, a ton of banking influence in the state. We have, the finance side of this, and then we have biomedicine. And that's really what's replaced. If you're looking at what defines our economy now, I mean, if you want one or two industries to focus on, those are the big industries. Well, that and residential construction with all the houses that are being built. But yeah, that's really what we've shifted to. So it's not that like we have a decent economy here, but it's just very, very different than it used to be. And there's been really a big break with the past starting around probably 2000 or so.
The Lilly plant actually opened up across the street not too long ago in Concord. Eli Lilly, which I believe they do diabetic medicine or something like that, insulin. I'm not for sure everything they do, but that plant is massive. And right outside of the Concord area, you have Charlotte, and pretty much all your Skyliners in Charlotte are all owned by the banks, whether it's the Wells Fargo building, the BB&T, or whatever they're calling it now. Of course, you have Bank of America, which is kind of your iconic Charlotte skyscraper building there. Kind of looks a little bit like the Empire State. But all that stuff only existed, in popularity, I guess, in the 90s when the economy started to shift a little bit to more of a financial sector. But even then, I noticed that a lot of the people that work at these jobs, and I interact with them from time to time, they're not from the state. So you still have that like problem of identity and who they are. And most of them kind of feel a little bit transitory because they don't know how long they're going to be in Charlotte. They come from Buffalo or other parts of New York, and they kind of think that they're going to be here maybe for about 5 years and then get moved somewhere else. So the banking industry and the financial industry kind of has a more transient turnover of people in this area.
That's true, and I was just thinking one big industry, as our friend Mr. Fahrenheit likes to point out a lot, is that we do have a lot of automobiles. So, especially dealerships, that has become a huge part of our economy. Just given I wouldn't call it excessive. We do have a robust car culture in the state, and of course now, like, you can add to that some types of manufacturing too. That'll be a big feature of the economy, and so that's another thing that you can kind of keep an eye on too, and that feel a little bit more permanent. Car people tend to be very concerned, and most of the salesmen I've met anyway, like if you're on the dealer level, tend to be, at least in my experience, pretty local guys.
So one thing to maybe look at is I think there have been some very important points made between economic necessity and cultural identity. One of the things that stood out to me a couple years back when I visited a friend in Alaska was he showed me his freezer completely full of salmon. And he said every year for 3 to 5 days, you basically have the entire community uh, gather by the river. You have a crowd that will be lifting these nets full of salmon out of the water. You'll have the people cleaning them, the people wrapping them, the people stocking them into the. It's a community joint effort. Um, and it really brings everybody together to this one purpose that fills everybody's freezers. And that's really good for this local sense of identity. And by law, only locals can do it. If you're from out of town, you can't participate. Um, so I think I think that's an interesting way that they keep kind of some of these traditions alive. But it also shows, these traditions are usually linked to the economy, like we were talking about. Tobacco days are harder to do when tobacco's left. Although I think if you can kind of keep that candle burning, it gives the state a little bit more rootedness. And maybe there's some revitalization there that can occur. But
There is
one thing that I
definitely.
think we could study out,
Oh no, you're good. Go ahead.
one thing that I think, oh, okay. I think one thing that I think we could study out is as we're talking about these varied sectors that North Carolina's invested in. Well, if you take Texas, Texas doesn't have a unified sector, economic sector that necessarily gives the state its identity, but they've still built up a very strong identity that people are able to assimilate into quickly. A lot of people are transplants from other states in the union, but they're conservatives at heart, and they kind of take on that Texas persona. I've seen people who moved there take that on. So I think I'm curious, kind of the process over which they obviously some of this identity came to them naturally. But are there some pointers over that history that we could almost take hints from at trying to construct uh, more of a North Carolina identity that gives our state a little bit more of an independent feel?
Looking at like, sort of towards the. I guess it's not the beginning of the state as a state. If you look at, I guess this would also apply in some degree to South Carolina, and I think this is actually a good argument for like North Carolina being closer to South Carolina than Virginia as far as culture goes. Although of course they receive influence from both as neighbors, but one really interesting thing about the Carolinas and North Carolina, especially during the Revolutionary War, was how much the state was able to rely on not just volunteers, but independently organized volunteers in the form of militias for handling their combat. I think that sort of, you can call it a partisan spirit, but not partisan in the bad way, but partisan in the sense that, like, these people had like really strong beliefs, and they were willing to like defend those beliefs to the point of losing their life, and they were willing to do this without being told to, or even being organized by like a central point in many cases. I think that speaks well to the character of the state. You have to have a lot of integrity, I suppose, to really take that sort of approach to life.
Yeah, I think that's a very strong point, and I think that goes to show how much of what we have to do is related to educating the people that are here. Because I, for one, as a newcomer, uh, am not particularly as familiar with North Carolina's history as I should be. And when I thought about how do I identify more with this place that I want to identify with as a North Carolinian now, I realized the biggest gap is the amount of history that I know about North Carolina versus other states. So you know, if I keep running with this Texas example because it's so easy because they have a state identity as we observed early on, but if if you identify with guys like Davy Crockett and Sam Houston and some of these other guys who fought at the Alamo, well, then you're going to see yourself as being their descendants to a degree. Um, in the same way you see on Twitter, people really strongly identifying with some of the Crusaders. You see yourself as belonging to their vein. And so the question is who are some of these heroes in North Carolina that we can educate and elevate people that have largely been forgotten, unfortunately, to build that we are the heirs of these type mentality.
You know, if you want to take almost like a field trip, um, as a way to kind of viscerally remind yourself of some parts of the state's history, one thing I recommend is that if you're in a major city, especially, that you visit their old what is the word, their municipal cemeteries. Because if you go there, you can tell by like the size of the biggest gravestones, like who the biggest contributors to the city were. This is a big feature of the South in general, but it includes North Carolina. Is that the South really built itself in many ways around paternalism at the city level. And so you can go to these big cities and, like, you know, in Winston-Salem, it's going to be someone like, you know, that's where I grew up. It's going to be someone like the Reynolds family, but like you can find these big families that that played such a big role in providing for the community in a sort of paternalistic sense. And then if you study their influence, you can sort of get a vision of, you know, like there's a lot of focus on organic culture, like from the ground up, I suppose. But there's also a sense in which you can study these like influential men and sort of the culture they sort of imposed from a top-down way, and that can give you kind of a good feel for at least how different regions of the state developed, and it can kind of help, you know, flesh out a picture of the whole.
The cemeteries, that's an excellent point. And can you hear me? I think my signal might actually be having some trouble.
I can hear you.
Perfect. I think the cemeteries, that's a great point. That actually might be something for us to consider, particularly for the Nathanael Greene Society within the Raleigh area. Maybe a day to visit Oakwood Cemetery. They offer excellent historic tours. They have, I think, 7 or 8 different tours featuring different elements of the state's past that are guided. And I've heard that those are top tier.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. I didn't realize they did tours. Um, the one in Winston may have. Me and a friend of mine kind of went in after hours one time and took a look at it. But yeah, no, if they offer tours, that'd be ideal because they can tell us stuff like we wouldn't be able to easily get from just our own research.
So we've discussed this for a little while. I'm also open to shifting the subject if anyone else has any topics that they'd like to bring to the table.
Um, Nothing immediately comes to mind unless we want to discuss any pressing current events. If there have been any major updates, I'm actually not entirely sure, but I think we did have some topics laid out. If we're interested in making a pivot that direction, I'm enjoying this conversation too, though, and I do think it's important. Honestly, I think as a group, and maybe I can make this note before we switch subjects. I believe by now most of our members, at least if they were here from the beginning, have probably finished the biography of Nathanael Greene. Did you actually ever, Brandon? Did you actually ever get a copy of that book, or was that ever explained to you when you joined that we sort of at the beginning had gotten that book?
No, I actually, I this is the first I'm hearing of it. So I'd love to get my hands on a copy and dig into
Yeah. So
that.
So sorry, that's kind of our fault. That's good for any new members. We'll post that in the chat as a reminder. That was at the very beginning. We weren't even like fully constituted yet, I don't think, at that point. But that was a great little read as far as it was the biography of Nathanael Greene, so it's not necessarily North Carolinian in its entirety because he was raised out of state. But that is good. But point being, I think it would be good for us to go back because like we had talked about books to read as a group, and I think this is a good idea for other chapters of the OGC as well. Obviously we're all busy, we got stuff to do, you can't do tons of reading, but it would be good, I think, to pick books that discuss the history of your state. Like it'd be good if we could research some good books on the history of North Carolina and sort of read, at least a few of them as a group. I think it's something we could definitely consider.
Yeah, even with local history within the state, there's a few books that come to mind. So, for instance, my family being up in the mountains, um, some historian, I forget the name, wrote an entire book on our county's Civil War experience. It's called Ashe County's Civil War, and it's interesting because it gives a pretty unique perspective on the war. In that, up in the mountains in North Carolina, Tennessee, and even in Virginia, those are some of the areas where you did see some of those brother on brother, cousin on cousin conflicts in the Civil War. For instance, up in Ashe County, simultaneously you had massive Confederate recruitment, but then you also had the Underground Railroad actively operating throughout the county. There's a particular mountain that's now called Jefferson Mount or Mount Jefferson that had used to have a different name. That used to be an Underground Railroad stop, for instance, and you'd have like Union cavalry rolling through and a lot of that. So it's interesting seeing like the mountain perspective in the Civil War. And I wonder if there's other books, kind of on local history within regions of the state that maybe we could push out to our members and get some appreciation on.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I've been reading Reconstruction in North Carolina by what's his name, J.G. Hamilton. And it's kind of like an overview of the politics, and it gives like a small breakdown of what North Carolina was going through during the Civil War and post Civil War. I'm not finished with the book, but it was interesting to get that perspective of the politics and like what the counties like how they were even divided during that time. And it was a nice reminder, or I guess a good reminder of how certain events weren't necessarily just as cut and dry as you would think they were. But
Yeah,
oh, go ahead.
I'll say I'd be interested to see kind of along those lines if there's any or if there are any books about I don't even know what to call it, the Wilmington Uprising in 1899 that aren't total like Yankee or leftist slop, um, or anything else along those lines. just seeing if there's any books out there that we can put on a list of, this is not slop. It's good North Carolina history. These are events in our history that have been repeatedly told in a paused perspective throughout history that we can finally appreciate properly.
Yeah, books like I found one book, but I don't know much about the author about the regulators in North Carolina and the situation around that. But I've not read it, and again, I'm not sure if it's slop or not. But I'm finding those kind of books, and like you were mentioning, um, finding different men that like in the different regions of North Carolina that were actually contributing to the area to help build it up. That would be
Yeah.
something quite interested in.
Yeah, in the future, we ought to do a series on the regulators, because that's a very interesting period in the state's history. We essentially had an American Revolution before it was cool. In the 1760s and into the 1770s, and then when the actual American Revolution kicked off, essentially the sides in the regulator conflict, flopped, which is very interesting. Every colonel and flag officer we produced in the Revolutionary War actually fought for the redcoats during the regulator movement, and then like almost every major regulator ended up being a loyalist. Very very interesting period in the state.
I actually went off on the regulators in the last live stream you guys had on Twitter, particularly Herman Husband.
Yeah, yeah. I know
Well,
a little bit about him.
the problem with the regulators is that they had very very obvious and well documented grievances with the way that the legislature was organized and the way that the sort of planter class was how they tolerated a certain amount of corruption. And as soon as the revolution broke out and the sort of upper crust of North Carolina started siding with the Continentals, it was kind of a slap in the face. Like Herman Husband uncovered, like from one land agent, 200 instances of collecting fees for registering with a land department, buying land and then never actually registering with the land department in the capital, you know, from one agent. And you know, Governor Tyron was okay with essentially half of taxes not being collected and just pocketed as grift just to save face. And, you kind of wonder why a lot of these frontier posses sided with the Tories against the very, very corrupt local government.
Yeah, honestly, like so much interesting. Like, I don't know if there's been a book written on it. I would love to read it if there was, about how essentially like the Revolutionary War in North Carolina was almost just a redo of like the old Scottish like clan conflicts, where like you had the people who were like a little bit more descended from the Ulster Scots who were very very loyal to the American cause, and then I believe it was the Highland Scots in Eastern North Carolina that were very loyalist, and how a lot of that was kind of like an ethnic feud in its own right. With a lot of the with like a lot of the Eastern Scottish, like were the Eastern Carolinian Scottish people just like self-deporting, if I remember correctly, after the war was over.
It's really ironic, I guess, the fact that just about all of the sort of Ulster Scots west of the Appalachians ended up siding with the Patriots, and a lot of the more like coastal, like Scots Irish, sided with the Patriots. But anyone just inland enough to experience frontier corruption with none of the benefits of being, I guess, communally regulated by regulator posses, ended up siding with the Tories. It's a very strange mix. Or at least that's what I've found from looking into the conflict.
Point being, our state's history is very interesting, and we would do well to just pick one of those periods and just kind of dig into it. There's a lot of like really niche stuff too. I will say this is one of the few remaining benefits of a physical public library, is that they will have like these sorts of like very obscure text in stock. You know, like entire books written on like the city of Kannapolis Mills, for example. You'll find those stocked in your library, or you can get them through loan. And yeah, no, I mean those are all, yeah. I think there's a lot of great potential here if we just want to choose an area, and we'll end up doing that in chat and then digging into it a little bit further.
Like, I remember going on this sort of bender on niche, like Carolina history of the early 18th century, and coming across some factoid about like half of North Carolina's economy was just feeding pirates and shipwrecking, or something like that. Something really absurd.
Yeah, no, there is that too, and I believe that was because of the it was because of the barrier islands, right? Wasn't that why we attracted so many? Also, just a little bit of a general lack of law and order compared to our neighbors.
Well, the thing was, you know, North Carolina was only recently broken off from the great proprietors, and you know the governor wasn't paid very much, and they kind of acted as a sort of halfway house for, or like, I remember going into the actual different smuggling rings during the golden age of piracy, and a few of them, you know, their basic loop was, you know, raid the Spanish, go to, you know, one of these halfway house sort of towns, whether it was like, you know, Jamaica or North Carolina, and then exchange those heavily prized goods for, you know, basic necessities like food or some sort of hard currency, and then spend that hard currency in Nassau. And the governors of North Carolina were very susceptible to, you know, any sort of high value good importation to the very, very poor colony. And that kind of stimulus kind of got the North Carolina economy off the ground. No one really talks about it, though. It's very niche, but it's very interesting to actually read.
Yeah, we were in some ways the Wild West of the East.
No, we really kind of were. That whole quote about us being the valley of humility between the two seas of pride, or between the two peaks of pride, is a little bit of a cope because we were just underdeveloped. But like, there is some cool, like, you know, character building influences that come from that in retrospect.
Yeah, there's much to be said about it because effectively, you know, for the longest time, between Charleston and you know, Jamestown or the areas around it in Virginia, there really was nothing. And you know, this is even up until 20, 30 years before the Revolution, and even during the Revolution. I mean, you had Charlotte, kind of, but it was like five or ten houses, and then you just had the roads. That's part of why, you know, Cornwallis had such a hard time going through the state. And whenever he'd fight a hard fought battle against, you know, General Greene, for instance, at Guilford Courthouse, he had to go all the way back to Charleston to refit, you know, because there really wasn't a whole lot to do in North Carolina. And, you know, even Wilmington, our only port city at that time, effectively wasn't really all that much, you know.
Which is actually funny. Well, it's one of those things that wouldn't have mattered as much then as it does now. Wilmington is actually one of the East Coast's better equipped ports, naturally speaking. So Wilmington's become very important. Yeah, but at the time it just wasn't, and it's kind of easy for us to forget that. In fact, if I remember correctly, wasn't that Nathanael Greene's primary strategy, because he knew North Carolina was so barren, that if he just well, okay, and so this ties back to the fact that North Carolinians were a little bit more partisan, is he could sort of rely on his army being a tad more self-sufficient than the British, and because there was just so little, advanced settlement in the state, he knew that the British army could just be worn out. And then, like you said, if they did get worn out sufficiently, they couldn't resupply here. They had to go all the way back to Charleston to do that. Or they could go north, which is what kind of ended up sealing the deal.
Definitely. Yeah, it's such a treasure trove of history to read about in the state. And then, even some of our lesser known engagements, with the militia in North Carolina. I've harped on it before, but out west in the mountain areas, you had the Watauga Association essentially forming their own independent republic, sort of like Vermont did, and then fighting, various battles against the Cherokee and other Indians, including some pretty major engagements over in Kingsport, Tennessee, at the Island Flats, and then contributing to the Western theater of the war. A lot of that history is just not even graced at all in the prevailing narrative of the revolution. So we have a pretty large amount of history to tap into, and hopefully we'll be able to cover a lot of these subjects going forward. Maybe do some sort of a cultural appreciation or history series on the state.
Yeah, I like that. I think there's a lot to draw from. Maybe even, I'm not very familiar with the local historical societies, but there's probably a lot of wealth of knowledge there. I had some communication with one of them once, because off the Neuse River, there's a location that used to be the homestead of the guy who went out and basically founded the first settlements in Tennessee. I'm trying to remember his name. Somebody here probably does.
Was it
But
John Sevier?
that's not who I'm thinking of. There's a plaque to him if you're down towards Wendell. If you go past Wendell in the direction of Clayton, east of Raleigh, there's a plaque. Uh, but I'm trying to recall his name. Um, but anyhow, the historical society was very helpful, and there are probably people there that would be excellent resources for identifying books of importance about local history.
Was the Watauga Association affiliated with the state of Franklin and how that
So the
developed?
the Watauga Association, to my knowledge, is what the state of Franklin emerged out of. They kind of fizzled out, I want to say, as the Paris Peace Accord was going on. I think they went defunct. Well, they didn't really officially stop. They just kind of petered out in the early 1780s, and then the state of Franklin movement. Um, it was the same group of people, the same concerns, generally speaking. Um, and I'm sure that tie is there officially. I'm just not entirely sure, but definitely in spirit, they're definitely tied. Um, the Overmountain men that fought at Kings Mountain largely were produced out of the Watauga Association group. It came about, I want to say, right about at the end of the Regulator movement. They really came about after the proclamation of 1763, but then formulated officially after the Regulator movement, and then they just sort of had their own thing going on until they decided to send most of their men down to Kings Mountain and then fought at the Island Flats. I think they sent some guys to fight out with George Rogers Clark up and down the Mississippi and in Kentucky. But then I believe they started the state of Franklin movement, and I'm not the most well versed on that. I think that just kind of petered out. Unfortunately, it's a very common trend with those kinds of mountain movements of just going to the wayside.
Like my impression of the state of Franklin was that it was, or at least that region of Tennessee was formed out of the remnants of the regulator movement who refused to swear oaths of loyalty to the governor of North Carolina, and especially a couple hundred Quakers who just flat out refused to swear oaths out of religious, you know, whatever. But uh, I came across a decent lecture from the American Revolution Institute on regulators, North Carolina regulators, the influence of the First Awakening, and the intersection of that and sort of quasi-independent republics that in states that came out of the Revolution. I'll post a link in the chat, but it's a very interesting topic. I briefly touch on it in my I wrote this 27,000 word long Substack article for OGC. It's coming out next Wednesday, and you Carolina guys are going to have a sort of cameo, like owing mostly due to Herman Husband.
Very neat, very neat. Yeah, some of the events we're going to do coming up here in the future. We're going to start the 250th anniversary tour. We'll do that, kind of as battles and whatnot occur in the state. So for this year, would be 1775. We have the Mecklenburg Declaration, and then moving forward, you've got Moores Creek Bridge, which we'll do an event next February for. But North Carolina spent most of the Revolution from that point until 1780 just committing a soft genocide against the Highlanders. But we'll be doing events up and down, and one of the events I want to do is I want to get the guys together, and we'll go out to Sycamore Shores or Sycamore Shoals. I can't speak with this stupid accent. Sycamore Shoals out in the North Carolina Tennessee border. It's right on the border. That's where the Overmountain men assembled. Um, I think they sorted out against Tarleton and then they dispersed, but then they assembled there at Sycamore Shoals. Um, and so you have John Sevier, Benjamin Cleveland, Isaac Shelby, all the other big names out of Wilkes County primarily. And that's where they made the decision to march on Kings Mountain. And it's this unassuming little rapid in, I forget the river. I want to say, I don't think it's the Yadkin River. It's one of those rivers up there. Just a little tiny river, unassuming. And there used to be a cabin there they met in. And from this little mountain valley, river, they assembled 1,800 men or so and marched down to Kings Mountain and wiped out that British force that then allowed General Greene to force Cornwallis out of the state. And I feel that's really a emblematic representation of North Carolina in the war, and then also North Carolina more generally. Um, so definitely we'll be looking out for that in the future.
Yeah, my property is about 20 minutes from Moores Creek, so I'll be looking forward to that. I don't know how you guys are handling. I don't know how widespread it is, but in the New Hanover and Pender counties, we've got a big problem with people coming down and taking up residence. And um, Burgaw, where my family's from, we do the Blueberry Festival every year. It's a big to do. I don't know if any of you guys are familiar with it, but we I was saying, I like standing by the statue, the Civil War memorial at the city hall there, and I overheard some purple-haired freak making comments about the statue, and you see houses going up. It's a one stoplight town. It's nothing, and Wilmington's pretty much maxed out at this point, and people are heading out to the western counties and building houses, buying an acre from a farmer and building houses, and it's becoming a real problem. I don't know how you guys are handling. I know the western areas, Asheville and stuff like that. They're dealing with the same thing. I don't know how people are handling it.
Yeah, it's a very common thing across the state more broadly and really in every region. So like you said, down in Pender County, with the Wilmington sprawl, we have the same issues. Raleigh, up in the mountains, my family's at, spreading out from Boone in particular. There's a very, very common trend of mostly Yankees. There are some North Carolinians doing it, but it's mostly Yankees buying up, like you say, an acre or two from a farmer. It's becoming a major problem up in the Appalachians. They buy their little 2 or 3 acres tract and put a cabin up there, and then they want to start complaining about us running farm equipment. Um, and to be honest with you, I'm not really sure what to do about it other than try to advocate and lobby against that. Maybe try to. I think one of the things we really need to be pushing for is agriculture protection laws. I'm not sure what form those would take, but really emphasizing that agricultural history and protecting that. There seems to be a very common trend among the boomer generation, and then as well among the Gen X and millennials. When these boomers are dying out, these older boomers and silent generation of, well, we have a family farm, we got 3 kids. One of the kids wants nothing to do with the farm, so now you have to essentially liquidate it and split the liquid assets. Um, so I think really the best thing we can be doing is advocating against that, pushing for specific legislation towards agricultural and historic protection. I think also trying to um, ensure that the inheritance tax does not come back. If I'm not mistaken, it doesn't exist currently in North Carolina, but there's always a move from the left to bring it back. So that's a big factor. But yeah.
It really is the sprawl that's the real blight, though. An actual city can be a nice place, but I just got back from Denver, and Denver is arguably one of the ugliest cities that I've ever been to for that reason. Salt Lake City's the same way. It's like the city was dropped out of a can of Play-Doh, and we just took a rolling pin and stretched it out as far as is imaginable. So it's just this endless concrete sprawl of parking lots and strip malls and residential houses. And unfortunately, that's the type of development that we see happening in North Carolina. What happened to Colorado in the 90s is happening to North Carolina in the 2010s and 2020s. And it's just because it's growth that's occurring too fast. You can't actually you're not actually seeing the natural population growth that led to I mean actual large cities like Boston. Um, Raleigh doesn't have the infrastructure to be that size. You have a very small
No, they do
historic
not.
city center.
Yeah. Yeah, Raleigh also has like sort of perennial issues now with like even basic things like their plumbing not working. Or plumbing's the wrong word, but like their like drainage not working very well. I used to work in environmental compliance for residential areas out in Raleigh, and they would have issues with like they're building so quickly that like sediment from sites just washes into their sewer system and backs it up. Yeah, so yeah, no, you're right. They're not really equipped for what they're dealing with, and they're not equipped for the growth that's going to continue just essentially for the foreseeable future.
The challenge is it's money, and it's hard to get people to turn that down. But I don't want Raleigh to become the next Nashville, because Nashville was the hot place to live for a while, and now it's borderline unlivable because the infrastructure just didn't scale with the city. And now, I talk to people who live out there, and they say none of the streets can handle the traffic. The municipal services are very underdeveloped for the size of everything. Certainly don't want to see that happen here, but I think it's very difficult to push um, legislation that slows development, unfortunately.
Well, and the good positive news too is that it's clubs like this that prevent or are a bulwark against the leftward drift of removing monuments and uh, all that kind of nonsense. That's what's got me interested in this. This is my first time here, so I'm just checking it out and liking what I'm hearing.
Well, we thank you for being here. Yeah, we're here to serve everyone in the state or all true Carolinians and friends. So yeah, we're happy to do this. You know, what we've been talking about tonight is a central part of our mission as a group. Help us learn who we are, so to speak, and then help reinforce that and strengthen it. Let's see, it is about 20 after 9. Are there any concluding thoughts before we sort of part ways for the evening?
I think it's been a great conversation. I, for one, have enjoyed hearing the conversation on North Carolina history that was carried out kind of midway through. A lot of things, it kind of helped put a lot of pieces together that I hadn't heard put together in that way. It was very enjoyable, and I thank you for inviting me to participate this evening.
Well, and we thank you for being here. We love hosting people from other chapters, and we also especially love hosting people from our own chapter. So we're very happy to have you. Well, all right. If there is no other parting comments, officers, feel free to butt in if there's any last thing you would like to say. But if there's none of that, then I think
I'll
we're
just
Yeah.
yeah, I'll just add. I think most of everyone here is, but if you are not a member of the Nathanael Greene Society or any of the other chapters of the OGC, feel free to reach out, to the Nathanael Greene Society or your state's local chapter and get involved as well.
All right. Thank you. Yes, please do. Anyone who's not a member, please reach out to us, and we're happy to figure out a way for you to get involved and become a member. So, all right, with that, I think we're good to go. Thank you for joining us. We'll be back same time next week, 8 o'clock, for another great discussion. And we look forward to seeing you then.
Thanks. See you then.